Now, when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. When I was serving my curacy in Portsmouth, I would regularly drive into the city on the M275. My turn-off was the one signposted to Hilsey, Copner, and North End. For the 3 years that I was taking that route regularly, I would always look out for that signpost and for the graffiti that had been sprayed across it. 3 words: grow up, Cooter. Who was Cooter? I would ponder as I indicated left. And had he ever grown up? Portsmouth was much in my thoughts last week, because I went there to assist at the funeral of the priest under whom I served my curacy. A number of former colleagues and former curates gathered for the occasion, and in the vestry afterwards, one of them reminded me about my first Advent Sunday in the parish. She had presided at the parish Eucharist. I was to act as deacon and preacher. But unbeknown to her, I had hidden myself in the parish hall. After the service had begun, and only after the procession had entered, I rushed into church, and I apologized for my late arrival. I begged her not to tell the vicar I had overslept. I was dressed in my pajamas and dressing gown. Be alert at all times, writes St. Luke. Well, the new curate was looking for a new way to give new expression to the Advent gospel of watchfulness and wakefulness, but I'm not sure she's ever forgiven me. Every year on Advent Sunday, we read from the apocalyptic teachings of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have versions of these, and they all attribute them to the last days of Jesus' ministry, after his arrival in Jerusalem, but before the Last Supper. To our ears, their imagery reads strangely. But they remind us that Jesus, or at least the early followers of Jesus, expected his glorious return imminently. The era of uncertainty and persecution through which they were living would not last very long. Their Lord would return to vindicate them. Their vocation was to keep watch for signs of his return, to be ready for it, to keep awake. You and I are asked to revisit that vocation every Advent. So this morning, we've heard of the signs that will appear in the sun, moon, and stars. We've been urged to look out for the fig tree's new leaves. But 2,000 years after those words were recorded, I guess that few of us are holding our breath for Christ's imminent, glorious return. So we might ask, for what signs are we looking? And for signs of what are we looking? To what do you and I need to wake up this Advent? Another Portsmouth experience has helped me to answer that question for myself. The vicar of Gosport used to invite the new curates in the diocese to preach a series of sermons in his church every year. In retrospect, it was a rather cunning move, which I guess gave him a few Sunday evenings off. But in 1999, we were asked to identify what we believed would be the principal need of the church in the new millennium, and to preach on that. I remember one of my contemporaries opted for the church needs to pray, and another for the church needs to testify. I chose the church needs to think. I know why I chose it. I'd only recently left a career as a lawyer. I liked propositional arguments and deductive reasoning. And I imagined that some cerebral activity, some solid theological legwork, would win a wavering generation to the unimpeachable logic of the gospel. They would be persuaded by the unimpeachable brilliance of our submissions. Well, two decades later, I'm far less sure of that. Let me turn to the monk and mystic Thomas Merton to explain why. In April 1940, not long before he entered the monastery, Merton, aged 25, visited Cuba. In his journal, he describes going into St. Francis's Church in Havana, hearing a choir of children begin to sing the creed. Something went off inside me like a thunderclap, he wrote. I knew that directly present was God in all his essence, all his power, God in himself, comparable to a thunderclap, to a shaking of the powers of heaven. Merton has an overwhelming experience of the divine and asks himself what has happened, to what he has been alerted. It was not just the apprehension of a reality, he writes, but equally a strong movement of great delight, like a great shout of joy. And in other words, it was as much an experience of loving as of knowing something. And in it, love and knowledge were completely inseparable. Love and knowledge were completely inseparable. What Merton wakes up to in an instant is what I'm still waking up to. That thinking only gets us so far. That the knowledge of God is not the same as the knowledge of the 5 times table or even the knowledge of the rules of hearsay evidence. Alone among the evangelists, Luke insists that Jesus' apocalyptic teachings are directed not at the disciples in private. According to Luke, Jesus addresses his words to all the people. And alone among the evangelists, Luke's Jesus tells all the people that the apocalyptic signs about which he is speaking do not herald a day of fear and dread. Just as Jeremiah had prophesied that both Israel and Judah are included in God's purposes and that their salvation and their safety are coming, so Jesus directs, when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. There's what we need to wake up to. Right there. The advent of God is the advent of redemption, not of condemnation. The advent of God is good news, and it is good news for all people. And that's precisely because of what Merton discovers that day in Havana. God cannot be only the object of our study, or the object of our understanding, or the object of our analysis. We can't think God. We can only be loved by God and stand up and raise our heads. It's Advent Sunday. A new year opens up before us, if you will, like an empty stretch of motorway, perhaps the M275. Of course, Hilsey and Copner and North End are to our left. Of course they are. And of course, the distance to them is 2 miles, or 3 miles, or 4 miles. We don't need a sign to tell us that. But what if we treat the signs as invitations, first to explore, and then to relate, and then to lose ourselves in what we discover? Who was Kuta? Did he ever grow up? And will we?